The story vault present, Agatha Christie, the man in the Miss Tommy was not pleased with life. Blunt's brilliant detectives had met with the reverse, distressing to their pride if not to their pockets. Called in professionally to elucidate the mystery of a stolen pearl necklace at Adlington Hall, Adlington, Blunt's brilliant detectives had failed to make good, whilst Tommy, hard on the track of a gambling countess, was tracking her in the disguise of a Roman Catholic priest, and Tuppence was getting off with a nephew of the house on the golf links. The local inspector of police had unemotionally arrested the second footman, who proved to be a thief well known at headquarters, and who admitted his guilt without making any bones about it. Tommy and Tuppence, therefore, had withdrawn with what dignity they could muster, and were at the present moment solacing themselves with cocktails at the Grand Adlington Hotel. Tommy still wore his clerical disguise. "Hardly a Father Brown touch, that," he remarked gloomily. "And yet I've got just the right kind of umbrella." "It wasn't a Father Brown problem," said Tuppence. "One needs a certain atmosphere from the start. One must be doing something quite ordinary, and then bizarre things begin to happen. That's the idea." "Unfortunately," said Tommy, "we have to return to town." "Perhaps something bizarre will happen on the way to the station." He raised the glass he was holding to his lips, but the liquid in it was suddenly spilled, as a heavy hand smacked him on the shoulder, and a voice to match the hand boomed out words of greeting. "Upon my soul, it is old Tommy. And Mrs. Tommy too. Where did you blow in from? Haven't seen or heard anything of you for years." "Why, it's Bulger," said Tommy, setting down what was left of the cocktail, and turning to look at the intruder. A big square-shouldered man of 30 years of age, with a round red beaming face, and dressed in golfing kit. "Good old Bulger." "But I say, old chap," said Bulger, whose real name, by the way, was Mervyn Escart, "I never knew you'd taken orders." "Fancy you a blinking parson." Tuppence burst out laughing, and Tommy looked embarrassed. And then they suddenly became conscious of a fourth person. A tall, slender creature, with very golden hair and very round blue eyes, almost impossibly beautiful, with an effect of really expensive black topped by wonderful ermines, and very large pearl earrings. She was smiling. And her smile said many things. It asserted, for instance, that she knew perfectly well that she herself was the thing best worth looking at, certainly in England, and possibly in the whole world. She was not vain about it in any way, but she just knew, with certainty and confidence, that it was so. Both Tommy and Tuppence recognized her immediately. They had seen her 3 times in The Secret of the Heart, and an equal number of times in that other great success, Pillars of Fire, and in innumerable other plays. There was, perhaps, no other actress in England who had so firm a hold on the British public as Miss Gilda Glenn. She was reported to be the most beautiful woman in England. It was also rumored that she was the stupidest. "Old friends of mine, Miss Glenn," said Escart, with a tinge of apology in his voice for having presumed, even for a moment, to forget such a radiant creature. "Tommy and Mrs. Tommy, let me introduce you to Miss Gilda Glenn." The ring of pride in his voice was unmistakable. By merely being seen in his company, Miss Glenn had conferred great glory upon him. The actress was staring with frank interest at Tommy. "Are you really a priest?" she asked. "A Roman Catholic priest, I mean? Because I thought they didn't have wives." Escart went off in a boom of laughter again. "That's good," he exploded. "You sly dog, Tommy. Glad he hasn't renounced you, Mrs. Tommy, with all the rest of the pomps and vanities." Gilda Glenn took not the faintest notice of him. She continued to stare at Tommy with puzzled eyes. "Are you a priest?" she demanded. Very few of us are what we seem to be, said Tommy gently. My profession is not unlike that of a priest. I don't give absolution, but I listen to confessions. Don't you listen to him, interrupted Escart. He's pulling your leg. If you're not a clergyman, I don't see why you're dressed up like one. She puzzled. That is, unless not a criminal flying from justice, said Tommy. The other thing. Oh, she frowned, and looked at him with beautiful bewildered eyes. I wonder if she'll ever get that, thought Tommy to himself, not unless I put it in words of one syllable for her, I should say. Aloud he said, Know anything about the trains back to town, Bulger? We've got to be pushing for home. How far is it to the station? 10 minutes walk. But no hurry. Next train up is the 6.35 and it's only about 20 to 6 now. You've just missed one. Which way is it to the station from here? Sharp to the left when you turn out of the hotel, then let me see, down Morgan's Avenue would be the best way. Wouldn't it? Morgan's Avenue? Miss Glenn started violently and stared at him with startled eyes. I know what you're thinking of, said Escart, laughing the ghost. Morgan's Avenue is bounded by the cemetery on one side, and tradition has it that a policeman who met his death by violence gets up and walks on his old beat up and down Morgan's Avenue. A spook policeman. Can you beat it? But lots of people swear to having seen him. A policeman, said Miss Glenn. She shivered a little. But there aren't really any ghosts, are there? I mean, there aren't such things? She got up, folding her wrap tight around her. Goodbye, she said vaguely. She had ignored Tuppence completely throughout, and now she did not even glance in her direction. But over her shoulder she threw one puzzled, questioning glance at Tommy. Just as she got to the door, she encountered a tall man with gray hair and a puffy red face who uttered an exclamation of surprise. His hand on her arm, he led her through the doorway, talking in an animated fashion. Beautiful creature, isn't she, Liz, said Escart. Brains of a rabbit. Rumor has it that she's going to marry Lord Leconbury. That was Leconbury in the doorway. He doesn't look a very nice sort of man to marry, remarked Tuppence. Escart shrugged his shoulders. A title has a kind of glamour still, I suppose, he said, and Leconbury is not an impoverished peer by any means. She'll be in clover. Nobody knows where she sprang from. Pretty near the gutter, I dare say. There's something deuced mysterious about her being down here anyway. She's not staying at the hotel. And when I tried to find out where she was staying, she snubbed me quite crudely, in the only way she knows, blessed if I know what it's all about. He glanced at his watch and uttered an exclamation. I must be off. Jolly glad to have seen you two again. We must have a bust in town together some night. So long. He hurried away, and as he did so, a page approached with a note on a salver. The note was unaddressed. But it's for you, sir, he said to Tommy. From Miss Gilda Glenn. Tommy tore it open and read it with some curiosity. Inside were a few lines written in a straggling, untidy hand. I'm not sure, but I think you might be able to help me. And you'll be going that way to the station. Could you be at the White House, Morgan's Avenue, at 10 minutes past 6? Yours sincerely, Gilda Glenn. Tommy nodded to the page who departed, and then handed the note to Tuppence. Extraordinary, said Tuppence. Is it because she still thinks you're a priest? No, said Tommy thoughtfully. I should say it's because she's at last taken in that I'm not one. Hello? What's this? This was a young man with flaming red hair, a pugnacious jaw, and appallingly shabby clothes. He had walked into the room and was now striding up and down, muttering to himself. "Hell," said the red-haired man, loudly and forcibly. "That's what I say, hell." He dropped into a chair near the young couple and stared at them moodily. "Damn all women, that's what I say," said the young man, eyeing Tuppence ferociously. "Oh. All right, kick up a row if you like, have me turned out of the hotel. It won't be for the first time. Why shouldn't we say what we think? Why should we go about bottling up our feelings, and smirking, and saying things exactly like everyone else? I don't feel pleasant and polite. I feel like getting hold of someone round the throat and gradually choking them to death." He paused. "Any particular person?" asked Tuppence, "or just anybody?" "One particular person," said the young man grimly. "This is very interesting," said Tuppence. "Won't you tell us some more?" "My name's Riley," said the red-haired man. "James Riley. You may have heard it. I wrote a little volume of pacifist poems, good stuff, although I say so." "Pacifist poems," said Tuppence. "Yes, why not?" demanded Mr. Riley belligerently. "Oh, nothing," said Tuppence hastily. "I'm for peace all the time," said Mr. Riley fiercely. "To hell with war. And women. Women. Did you see that creature who was trailing around here just now? Gilda Glenn, she calls herself. Gilda Glenn. God! How I've worshipped that woman. And I'll tell you this, if she's got a heart at all, it's on my side. She cared once for me, and I could make her care again. And if she sells herself to that muck-heap Lecanbury, well, God help her. I'd as soon kill her with my own hands." And on this, suddenly, he rose and rushed from the room. Tommy raised his eyebrows. "A somewhat excitable gentleman," he murmured. "Well, Tuppence, shall we start?" A fine mist was coming up as they emerged from the hotel into the cool outer air. Obeying Escart's directions, they turned sharp to the left, and in a few minutes they came to a turning labeled Morgan's Avenue. The mist had increased. It was soft and white, and hurried past them in little eddying drifts. To their left was the high wall of the cemetery, on their right a row of small houses. Presently these ceased, and a high hedge took their place. "Tommy," said Tuppence, "I'm beginning to feel jumpy." The mist and the silence. As though we were miles from anywhere. "One does feel like that," agreed Tommy. "All alone in the world. It's the effect of the mist, and not being able to see ahead of one." Tuppence nodded. "Just our footsteps echoing on the pavement. What's that?" "What's what?" "I thought I heard other footsteps behind us." "You'll be seeing the ghost in a minute if you work yourself up like this," said Tommy kindly. "Don't be so nervy. Are you afraid the spook policeman will lay his hand on your shoulder?" Tuppence emitted a shrill squeal. "Don't, Tommy. Now you've put it into my head." She craned her head back over her shoulder, trying to peer into the white veil that was wrapped all round them. "There they are again," she whispered. "No, they're in front now." "Oh. Tommy, don't say you can't hear them." "I do hear something." "Yes, it's footsteps behind us. Somebody else walking this way to catch the train." "I wonder." He stopped suddenly, and stood still, and Tuppence gave a gasp. For the curtain of mist in front of them suddenly parted in the most artificial manner, and there, not 20 feet away, a gigantic policeman suddenly appeared, as though materialized out of the fog. One minute he was not there, the next minute he was, so at least it seemed to the rather superheated imaginations of the two watchers. Then as the mist rolled back still more, a little scene appeared, as though set on a stage. The big blue policeman, a scarlet pillar box, and on the right of the road the outlines of a White House. "Red, white, and blue," said Tommy. "It's damned pictorial. Come on. Tuppence, there's nothing to be afraid of." For, as he had already seen, the policeman was a real policeman. And moreover, he was not nearly so gigantic as he had at first seemed looming up out of the mist. But as they started forward, footsteps came from behind them, a man passed them, hurrying along. He turned in at the gate of the White House, ascended the steps, and beat a deafening tattoo upon the knocker. He was admitted just as they reached the spot where the policeman was standing staring after him. "There's a gentleman seems to be in a hurry," commented the policeman. He spoke in a slow reflective voice, as of one whose thoughts took some time to mature. "He's the sort of gentleman always would be in a hurry," remarked Tommy. The policeman's stare, slow and rather suspicious, came round to rest on his face. "Friend of yours?" he demanded, and there was distinct suspicion now in his voice. "No," said Tommy. "He's not a friend of mine, but I happen to know who he is." "Name of Riley." "Ah," said the policeman. "Well, I'd better be getting along." "Can you tell me where the White House is?" asked Tommy. The constable jerked his head sideways. "This is it. Mrs. Honeycott's." He paused, and added, evidently with the idea of giving them valuable information, "Nervous party. Always suspecting burglars is around. Always asking me to have a look around the place. Middle-aged women get like that." "Middle-aged, eh?" said Tommy. "Do you happen to know if there's a young lady staying there?" "A young lady," said the policeman, ruminating. "A young lady. No, I can't say I know anything about that." "She mayn't be staying here, Tommy," said Tuppence. "And anyway, she mayn't be here yet. She could only have started just before we did." "Ah," said the policeman suddenly. "Now that I call it to mind, a young lady did go in at this gate. I saw her as I was coming up the road. About 3 or 4 minutes ago it might be." "With ermine furs on?" asked Tuppence eagerly. "She had some kind of white rabbit round her throat," admitted the policeman. Tuppence smiled. The policeman went on in the direction from which they had just come, and they prepared to enter the gate of the White House. Suddenly a faint muffled cry sounded from inside the house, and almost immediately afterwards the front door opened and James Riley came rushing down the steps. His face was white and twisted, and his eyes glared in front of him unseeingly. He staggered like a drunken man. He passed Tommy and Tuppence as though he did not see them, muttering to himself with a kind of dreadful repetition, "My God! My God! Oh, my God!" He clutched at the gate-post, as though to steady himself, and then, as though animated by sudden panic, he raced off down the road as hard as he could go in the opposite direction to that taken by the policeman. Tommy and Tuppence stared at each other in bewilderment. "Well," said Tommy, "something's happened in that house to scare our friend Riley pretty badly." Tuppence drew her finger absently across the gate-post. "He must have put his hand on some wet red paint somewhere," she said idly. Said Tommy. "I think we'd better go inside rather quickly. I don't understand this business." In the doorway of the house a white-capped maid-servant was standing, almost speechless with indignation. "Did you ever see the likes of that now, father?" she burst out, as Tommy ascended the steps. That fellow comes here, asks for the young lady, rushes upstairs without how or by your leave. She lets out a screech like a wild cat, and what wonder, poor pretty dear, and straightway he comes rushing down again, with the white face on him, like one who's seen a ghost. What will be the meaning of it all? Who are you talking with at the front door, Ellen? Demanded a sharp voice from the interior of the hall. Here's Mrs., said Ellen, somewhat unnecessarily. She drew back and Tommy found himself confronting a gray-haired, middle-aged woman, with frosty blue eyes imperfectly concealed by pince-nez, and a spare figure clad in black with bugle trimming. Mrs. Honeycutt, said Tommy. I came here to see Miss Glenn. Mrs. Honeycutt gave him a sharp glance, then went on to Tuppence and took in every detail of her appearance. Oh, you did you? She said. Well, you'd better come inside. She led the way into the hall and along it into a room at the back of the house facing on the garden. It was a fair-sized room, but looked smaller than it was, owing to the large amount of chairs and tables crowded into it. A big fire burned in the grate, and a chintz-covered sofa stood at one side of it. The wallpaper was a small gray stripe with a festoon of roses round the top. Quantities of engravings and oil paintings covered the walls. It was a room almost impossible to associate with the expensive personality of Miss Gilda Glenn. Sit down, said Mrs. Honeycutt. To begin with, you'll excuse me if I say I don't hold with the Roman Catholic religion. Never did I think to see a Roman Catholic priest in my house. But if Gilda's gone over to the Scarlet Woman, it's only what's to be expected in a life like hers, and I daresay it might be worse. She mightn't have any religion at all. I should think more of Roman Catholics if their priests were married. I always speak my mind. And to think of those convents, quantities of beautiful young girls shut up there, and no one knowing what becomes of them. Well, it won't bear thinking about. Mrs. Honeycutt came to a full stop, and drew a deep breath. Without entering upon a defense of the celibacy of the priesthood or the other controversial points touched upon, Tommy went straight to the point. I understand, Mrs. Honeycutt, that Miss Glenn is in this house. She is. Mind you, I don't approve. Marriage is marriage, and your husband's your husband. As you make your bed, so you must lie on it. I don't quite understand, began Tommy, bewildered. I thought as much. That's the reason I brought you in here. You can go up to Gilda after I've spoken my mind. She came to me after all these years. Think of it, and asked me to help her, wanted me to see this man and persuade him to agree to a divorce. I told her straight out I'd have nothing whatever to do with it. Divorce is sinful. But I couldn't refuse my own sister shelter in my house, could I now? Your sister, exclaimed Tommy. Yes, Gilda's my sister. Didn't she tell you? Tommy stared at her open-mouthed. The thing seemed fantastically impossible. Then he remembered that the angelic beauty of Gilda Glenn had been in evidence for many years. He had been taken to see her act as quite a small boy. Yes, it was possible after all. But what a piquant contrast! So it was from this lower middle-class respectability that Gilda Glenn had sprung. How well she had guarded her secret! I am not yet quite clear, he said. Your sister is married? Ran away to be married as a girl of 17, said Miss Honeycutt succinctly. Some common fellow far below her in station. And our father a reverend. It was a disgrace. Then she left her husband and went on the stage. Play acting. I've never been inside a theater in my life. I hold no truck with wickedness. Now, after all these years, She wants to divorce the man, means to marry some bigwig, I suppose. But her husband's standing firm not to be bullied and not to be bribed. I admire him for it." "What is his name?" asked Tommy suddenly. "That's an extraordinary thing now, but I can't remember. It's nearly 20 years ago, remember, since I heard it. My father forbade it to be mentioned. And I've refused to discuss the matter with Gilda. She knows what I think, and that's enough for her." "It wasn't Riley, was it?" "Might have been. I really can't say. It's gone clean out of my head. The man I mean was here just now." "That man? I thought he was an escaped lunatic." "I'd been in the kitchen giving orders to Ellen. I just got back into this room, and was wondering whether Gilda had come in yet. She has a latchkey, when I heard her. She hesitated a minute or two in the hall and then went straight upstairs. About 3 minutes later, all this tremendous rat-tatting began. I went out into the hall, and just saw a man rushing upstairs. Then there was a sort of cry upstairs, and presently down he came again and rushed out like a madman. Pretty goings-on." Tommy rose. "Mrs. Honeycutt, let us go upstairs at once." "I am afraid what of?" "Afraid that you have no red wet paint in the house." Mrs. Honeycutt stared at him. "Of course I haven't." "That is what I feared," said Tommy gravely. "Please let us go to your sister's room at once." Momentarily silenced, Mrs. Honeycutt led the way. They caught a glimpse of Ellen in the hall, backing hastily into one of the rooms. Mrs. Honeycutt opened the first door at the top of the stairs. Tommy and Tuppence entered close behind her. Suddenly she gave a gasp and fell back. A motionless figure in black and ermine lay stretched on the sofa. The face was untouched, a beautiful soulless face like a mature child asleep. The wound was on the side of the head. A heavy blow with some blunt instrument had crushed in the skull. Blood was dripping slowly onto the floor, but the wound itself had long since ceased to bleed. Tommy examined the prostrate figure, his face very white. "So," he said at last, "he didn't strangle her after all. What do you mean?" "Who?" cried Mrs. Honeycutt. "Is she dead?" "Oh, yes, Mrs. Honeycutt, she's dead." "Murdered." "The question is by whom?" "Not that it is much of a question." Funny, for all his ranting words, I didn't think the fellow had got it in him. He paused a minute, then turned to Tuppence with decision. "Will you go out and get a policeman, or ring up the police station from somewhere?" Tuppence nodded. She, too, was very white. Tommy led Mrs. Honeycutt downstairs again. "I don't want there to be any mistake about this," he said. "Do you know exactly what time it was when your sister came in?" "Yes, I do," said Mrs. Honeycutt, "because I was just setting the clock on 5 minutes as I have to do every evening. It gains just 5 minutes a day. It was exactly 8 minutes past 6 by my watch, and that never loses or gains a second." Tommy nodded. That agreed perfectly with the policeman's story. He had seen the woman with the white furs go in at the gate. Probably 3 minutes had elapsed before he and Tuppence had reached the same spot. He had glanced at his own watch then and had noted that it was just 1 minute after the time of their appointment. There was just the faint chance that someone might have been waiting for Gilda Glenn in the room upstairs. But if so, he must still be hiding in the house. No one but James Riley had left it. He ran upstairs and made a quick but efficient search of the premises. But there was no one concealed anywhere. Then he spoke to Ellen. After breaking the news to her, and waiting for her first lamentations and invocations to the saints to have exhausted themselves, he asked a few questions. Had anyone come to the house that afternoon asking for Miss Glenn? No one whatsoever. Had she herself been upstairs at all that evening? Yes, she'd gone up at 6 o'clock as usual to draw the curtains, or it might have been a few minutes after 6. Anyway, it was just before that wild fellow come breaking the knocker down. She'd run downstairs to answer the door. And him a black-hearted murderer at the time. Tommy let it go at that. But he still felt a curious pity for Riley, an unwillingness to believe the worst of him. And yet there was no one else who could have murdered Gilda Glenn. Mrs. Honeycutt and Ellen had been the only two people in the house. He heard voices in the hall, and went out to find Tuppence and the policeman from the beat outside. The latter had produced a notebook, and a rather blunt pencil which he licked surreptitiously. He went upstairs and surveyed the victim stolidly, merely remarking that if he was to touch anything the inspector would give him beans. He listened to all Mrs. Honeycutt's hysterical outbursts and confused explanations, and occasionally he wrote something down. His presence was calming and soothing. Tommy finally got him alone for a minute or two on the steps outside, ere he departed to telephone headquarters. "Look here," said Tommy. "You saw the deceased turning in at the gate, you say. Are you sure she was alone?" "Oh, she was alone all right. Nobody with her." "And between that time and when you met us, nobody came out of the gate?" "Not a soul." "You'd have seen them if they had?" "In course I should. Nobody come out till that wild chap did." The majesty of the law moved portentously down the steps and paused by the white gatepost which bore the imprint of a hand in red. "Kind of amateur he must have been," he said pityingly, "to leave a thing like that." Then he swung out into the road. It was the day after the crime. Tommy and Tuppence were still at the Grand Hotel, but Tommy had thought it prudent to discard his clerical disguise. James Riley had been apprehended, and was in custody. His solicitor, Mr. Marple, had just finished a lengthy conversation with Tommy on the subject of the crime. "I never would have believed it of James Riley," he said simply. "He's always been a man of violent speech, but that's all." Tommy nodded. "If you disperse energy in speech, it doesn't leave you too much over for action. What I realize is that I shall be one of the principal witnesses against him." That conversation he had with me just before the crime was particularly damning. And in spite of everything, I like the man, and if there was anyone else to suspect, I should believe him to be innocent. What's his own story? The solicitor pursed up his lips. He declares that he found her lying there dead. But that's impossible, of course. He's using the first lie that comes into his head. Because, if he happened to be speaking the truth, it would mean that our garrulous Mrs. Honeycutt committed the crime, and that is fantastic. Yes, he must have done it. The maid heard her cry out, "Remember." The maid yes. Tommy was silent a moment, then he said thoughtfully, "What credulous creatures we are, really. We believe evidence as though it were gospel truth. And what is it ready? Only the impressions conveyed to the mind by the senses, and suppose they're the wrong impressions?" The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. "Oh. We all know that there are unreliable witnesses who remember more and more as time goes on. With no real intention to deceive. I don't mean only that, I mean all of us, we say things that aren't really so, and never know that we've done so. For instance, both you and I, without doubt, have said some time or other 'there's the post,' when what we really meant was that we'd heard a double knock and the rattle of the letter box. 9 times out of 10 we'd be right, and it would be the post, but just possibly the 10th time it might be only a little urchin playing a joke on us. See what I mean? Yes, said Mr. Marvel slowly, but I don't see what you're driving at. Don't you? I'm not sure that I do myself. But I'm beginning to see. It's like the stick. Tuppence. You remember? One end of it pointed one way, but the other end always points the opposite way. It depends whether you get hold of it by the right end. Doors open, but they also shut. People go upstairs, but they also go downstairs. Boxes shut, but they also open. What do you mean? Demanded Tuppence. It's so ridiculously easy, really, said Tommy. And yet it's only just come to me. How do you know when a person's come into the house? You hear the door open and bang to, and if you're expecting anyone to come in, you will be quite sure it is them. But it might just as easily be someone going out. But Miss Glenn didn't go out? No, I know she didn't, but someone else did, the murderer. But how did she get in then? She came in whilst Mrs. Honeycutt was in the kitchen talking to Ellen. They didn't hear her. Mrs. Honeycutt went back to the drawing room, wondered if her sister had come in and began to put the clock right, and then, as she thought, she heard her come in and go upstairs. Well, what about that? The footsteps going upstairs? That was Ellen, going up to draw the curtains. You remember, Mrs. Honeycutt said her sister paused before going up. That pause was just the time needed for Ellen to come out from the kitchen into the hall. She just missed seeing the murderer. But Tommy, cried Tuppence. The cry she gave? That was James Riley. Didn't you notice what a high-pitched voice he has? In moments of great emotion, men often squeal just like a woman. But the murderer? We'd have seen him? We did see him. We even stood talking to him. Do you remember the sudden way that policeman appeared? That was because he stepped out of the gate, just after the mist cleared from the road. It made us jump, don't you remember? After all, though we never think of them as that, policemen are men just like any other men. They love and they hate. They marry. I think Gilda Glenn met her husband suddenly just outside that gate, and took him in with her to thrash the matter out. He hadn't Riley's relief of violent words, remember. He just saw red and he had his truncheon handy. Agatha Christie, the crackler Tuppence, said Tommy, we shall have to move into a much larger office. Nonsense, said Tuppence. You mustn't get swollen-headed and think you are a millionaire just because you solved 2 or 3 two-penny halfpenny cases with the aid of the most amazing luck. What some call luck, others call skill. Of course, if you really think you are Sherlock Holmes, Thorndyke, McCarty and the brothers Oakwood all rolled into one, there is no more to be said. Personally, I would much rather have luck on my side than all the skill in the world. Perhaps there is something in that, conceded Tommy. All the same, Tuppence, we do need a larger office. Why? The classics, said Tommy. We need several hundreds of yards of extra bookshelf if Edgar Wallace is to be properly represented. We haven't had an Edgar Wallace case yet. I am afraid we never shall, said Tommy. If you notice, he never does give the amateur sleuth much of a chance. It is all stern Scotland Yard kind of stuff, the real thing and no base counterfeit. Albert, the office boy, appeared at the door. Inspector Marriott to see you, he announced. The mystery man of Scotland Yard, murmured Tommy. The busiest of the busies, said Tuppence. Or is it noses? I always get mixed between busies and noses. The inspector advanced upon them with a beaming smile of welcome. "Well, and how are things?" he asked breezily. "None the worse for our little adventure the other day?" "Oh, rather not," said Tuppence. Too marvelous, wasn't it?" "Well, I don't know that I would describe it exactly that way myself," said Marriott cautiously. "What has brought you here today, Marriott?" asked Tommy. "Not just solicitude for our nervous systems." "Is it?" "No," said the inspector. "It is work for the brilliant Mr. Blunt." "Ha," said Tommy. "Let me put my brilliant expression on. I have come to make you a proposition, Mr. Beresford. What would you say to rounding up a really big gang?" "Is there such a thing?" asked Tommy. "What do you mean, is there such a thing?" "I always thought that gangs were confined to fiction like master crooks and super criminals." "The master crook isn't very common," agreed the inspector. "But Lord bless you, sir, there's any amount of gangs knocking about. I don't know that I should be at my best dealing with a gang," said Tommy. "The amateur crime, the crime of quiet family life, that is where I flatter myself that I shine. Drama of strong domestic interest. That's the thing with Tuppence at hand to supply all those little feminine details which are so important, and so apt to be ignored by the denser male." His eloquence was arrested abruptly, as Tuppence threw a cushion at him and requested him not to talk nonsense. "We'll have your little bit of fun, won't you, sir?" said Inspector Marriott, smiling paternally at them both. "If you'll not take offense at my saying so. It's a pleasure to see two your people enjoying life as much as you two do." "Do we enjoy life?" said Tuppence, opening her eyes very wide. "I suppose we do. I've never thought about it before." "To return to that gang you were talking about," said Tommy. "In spite of my extensive private practice, duchesses, millionaires, and all the best charwomen, I might perhaps condescend to look into the matter for you. I don't like to see Scotland Yard at fault. You'll have the Daily Mail after you before you know where you are. As I said before, you must have your bit of fun. Well, it's like this." Again he hitched his chair forward. "There's any amount of forged notes going about just now, hundreds of them. The amount of counterfeit treasury notes in circulation would surprise you. Most artistic bit of work it is. Here's one of 'em." He took a £1 note from his pocket and handed it to Tommy. "Looks all right, doesn't it?" Tommy examined the note with great interest. "By Jove, I'd never spot there was anything wrong with that. No more would most people. Now here's a genuine one. I'll show you the differences, very slight they are, but you'll soon learn to tell them apart. Take this magnifying glass." At the end of 5 minutes' coaching, both Tommy and Tuppence were fairly expert. "What do you want us to do, Inspector Marriott?" asked Tuppence. "Just keep our eyes open for these things?" "A great deal more than that, Mrs. Beresford. I'm pinning my faith on you to get to the bottom of the matter. You see, we've discovered that the notes are being circulated from the West End. Somebody pretty high up in the social scale is doing the distributing. They're passing them the other side of the channel as well. Now there's a certain person who is interesting us very much. A Major Laidlaw, perhaps you've heard the name?" "I think I have," said Tommy. "Connected with racing, isn't that it?" "Yes. Major Laidlaw is pretty well known in connection with the turf. There's nothing actually against him, but there's a general impression that he's been a bit too smart over one or two rather shady transactions. Men in the know look queer when he's mentioned. Nobody knows much of his past or where he came from. He's got a very attractive French wife who's seen about everywhere with a train of admirers. They must spend a lot of money, the Laidlaws, and I'd like to know where it comes from. Possibly from the train of admirers, suggested Tommy. That's the general idea. But I'm not so sure. It may be coincidence, but a lot of notes have been forthcoming from a certain very smart little gambling club which is much frequented by the Laidlaws and their set. This racing, gambling set get rid of a lot of loose money in notes. There couldn't be a better way of getting it into circulation. And where do we come in? This way. Young St. Vincent and his wife are friends of yours, I understand? They're in pretty thick with the Laidlaw set, though not as thick as they were. Through them it will be easy for you to get a footing in the same set in a way that none of our people could attempt. There's no likelihood of their spotting you. You'll have an ideal opportunity. What have we got to find out exactly? Where they get the stuff from, if they are passing it. Quite so, said Tommy. Major Laidlaw goes out with an empty suitcase. When he returns it is crammed to the bursting point with treasury notes. How is it done? I sleuth him and find out. Is that the idea? More or less. But don't neglect the lady, and her father, M. Harrelade. Remember the notes are being passed on both sides of the channel. My dear Marriott, exclaimed Tommy reproachfully. Blunt's brilliant detectives do not know the meaning of the word neglect. The inspector rose. Well, good luck to you, he said, and departed. Slush, said Tuppence enthusiastically. Said Tommy perplexed. Counterfeit money, explained Tuppence. It is always called slush. I know I'm right. Oh, Tommy, we have got an Edgar Wallace case. At last we are busies. We are, said Tommy, and we are out to get the crackler and we will get him good. Did you say the cackler or the crackler? The crackler. Oh, what is a crackler? A new word that I have coined, said Tommy. Descriptive of one who passes false notes into circulation. Bank notes crackle. Therefore he is called a crackler. Nothing could be more simple. That is rather a good idea, said Tuppence. It makes it seem more real. I like the rustler myself. Much more descriptive and sinister. No, said Tommy, I said the crackler first and I stick to it. I shall enjoy this case, said Tuppence. Lots of nightclubs and cocktails in it. I shall buy some eyelash black tomorrow. Your eyelashes are black already, objected her husband. I could make them blacker, said Tuppence, and cherry lipstick would be useful too. That ultra-bright kind. Tuppence, said Tommy, you're a real rake at heart. What a good thing it is that you are married to a sober, steady, middle-aged man like myself. You wait, said Tuppence. When you have been to the Python Club a bit you mayn't be so sober yourself. Tommy produced from a cupboard various bottles, 2 glasses, and a cocktail shaker. Let's start now, he said. We are after you, crackler, and we mean to get you. Making the acquaintance of the Laidlaws proved an easy affair. Tommy and Tuppence, young, well-dressed, eager for life and with apparently money to burn, were soon made free of that particular coterie in which the Laidlaws had their being. Major Laidlaw was a tall, fair man, typically English in appearance, with a hearty sportsmanlike manner, slightly belied by the hard lines round his eyes and the occasional quick sideways glance that assorted oddly with his supposed character. He was a very dexterous card player, and Tommy noticed that when the stakes were high he seldom rose from the table a loser. Marguerite Laidlaw was quite a different proposition. She was a charming creature, with the slenderness of a wood nymph and the face of a Greuze picture. Her dainty broken English was fascinating, and Tommy felt that it was no wonder most men were her slaves. She seemed to take a great fancy to Tommy from the first, and playing his part, he allowed himself to be swept into her train. "My Tommy," she would say. "But positively I cannot go without my Tommy. His air, eetees the color of the sunset, eeset not?" Her father was a more sinister figure. Very correct, very upright, with his little black beard and his watchful eyes. Tuppence was the first to report progress. She came to Tommy with 10 one-pound notes. "Have a look at these. They're wrong UNS, aren't they?" Tommy examined them and confirmed Tuppence's diagnosis. "Where did you get them from?" "That boy, Jimmy Faulkner. Marguerite Laidlaw gave them to him to put on a horse for her. I said I wanted small notes, and gave him a tenner in exchange." "All new and crisp," said Tommy thoughtfully. "They can't have passed through many hands. I suppose young Faulkner is all right?" "Jimmy? Oh, he's a dear. He and I are becoming great friends." "So I have noticed," said Tommy coldly. "Do you really think it is necessary?" "Oh, it isn't business," said Tuppence cheerily. "It's pleasure. He's such a nice boy. I'm glad to get him out of that woman's clutches. You've no idea of the amount of money she's cost him. It looks to me as though he were getting rather a pash for you, Tuppence." "I've thought the same myself sometimes. It's nice to know one's still young and attractive, isn't it?" "Your moral tone, Tuppence, is deplorably low. You look at these things from the wrong point of view." "I haven't enjoyed myself so much for years," declared Tuppence shamelessly, "and anyway, what about you? Do I ever see you nowadays? Aren't you always living in Marguerite Laidlaw's pocket?" "Business," said Tommy crisply. "But she is attractive, isn't she?" "Not my type," said Tommy. "I don't admire her." "Liar," laughed Tuppence. "But I always did think I'd rather marry a liar than a fool, I suppose," said Tommy, "that there's no absolute necessity for a husband to be either." But Tuppence merely threw him a pitying glance and withdrew. Amongst Mrs. Laidlaw's train of admirers was a simple but extremely wealthy gentleman of the name of Hank Ryder. Mr. Ryder came from Alabama, and from the first he was disposed to make a friend and confidant of Tommy. "That's a wonderful woman, sir," said Mr. Ryder, following the lovely Marguerite with reverential eyes. "Plumb full of civilization. Can't beat La Gay France, can you? When I'm near her, I feel as though I was one of the Almighty's earliest experiments. I guess he'd got to get his hand in before he attempted anything so lovely as that perfectly lovely woman." Tommy agreeing politely with these sentiments, Mr. Ryder unburdened himself still further. "Seems kind of a shame a lovely creature like that should have money worries." "Has she?" asked Tommy. "You betcha life she has. Queer fish, Laidlaw. She's scared of him. Told me so. Daren't tell him about her little bills." "Are they little bills?" asked Tommy. "Well, when I say little. After all, a woman's got to wear clothes, and the less there are of them the more they cost, the way I figure it out. And a pretty woman like that doesn't want to go about in last season's goods. Cards too, the poor little thing's been mighty unlucky at cards. Why, she lost 50 to me last night." "She won 200 from Jimmy Faulkner the night before," said Tommy drily. "Did she indeed? That relieves my mind some. By the way, there seems to be a lot of dud notes floating around in your country just now. I paid in a bunch at my bank this morning, and 25 of them were down and outers. So the polite gentleman behind the counter informed me. That's rather a large proportion. Were they new looking? New and crisp as they make 'em. Why, they were the ones Mrs. Laidlaw paid over to me, I reckon. Wonder where she got 'em from. One of these toughs on the racecourse as likely as not. Yes, said Tommy. Very likely. You know, Mr. Beresford, I'm new to this sort of high life. All these swell dames, and the rest of the outfit. Only made my pile a short while back. Came right over to Europe to see life. Tommy nodded. He made a mental note to the effect that with the aid of Marguerite Laidlaw Mr. Ryder would probably see a good deal of life and that the price charged would be heavy. Meantime, for the second time, he had evidence that the forged notes were being distributed pretty near at hand, and that in all probability Marguerite Laidlaw had a hand in their distribution. On the following night he himself was given a proof. It was at that small select meeting place mentioned by Inspector Marriott. There was dancing there, but the real attraction of the place lay behind a pair of imposing folding doors. There were 2 rooms there with green baize-covered tables, where vast sums changed hands nightly. Marguerite Laidlaw, rising at last to go, thrust a quantity of small notes into Tommy's hands. They are so bulky, Tommy, you will change them, yes? A big note. See my so sweet little bag, it bulges him to distraction. Tommy brought her the £100 note she asked for, then in a quiet corner, he examined the notes she had given him. At least a quarter of them were counterfeit. But where did she get her supplies from? To that he had as yet no answer. By means of Albert's cooperation, he was almost sure that Laidlaw was not the man. His movements had been watched closely and had yielded no result. Tommy suspected her father, the Saturnine M. Harrelade. He went to and fro to France fairly often. What could be simpler than to bring the notes across with him? A false bottom to a trunk, something of that kind. Tommy strolled slowly out of the club, absorbed in these thoughts, but was suddenly recalled to immediate necessities. Outside in the street was Mr. Hank P. Ryder, and it was clear at once that Mr. Ryder was not strictly sober. At the moment he was trying to hang his hat on the radiator of a car, and missing it by some inches every time. "This god-darned hatchstand, this god-darned hatchstand," said Mr. Ryder tearfully. "Not like that in the States. Man can hang up his hat every night, sir. You're wearing 2 hatches. Never seen a man wearing 2 hatch before. Mushed buffect climate." "Perhaps I've got 2 heads," said Tommy gravely. "Show you have," said Mr. Ryder. "Thatch odd. Thatch remarkable fac. Let's have a cocktail. Prohibition Thatch watch done me in. I guess I'm drunk, constitutionally drunk. Cocktails mixed angels kiss, that's Marguerite lovely creature. Follow me too, horse's neck, 2 martinis 3 road to ruin schno, roadsto rune mixed all in a beer tankard. Bet me I wouldn't, I shade to hell, I shade dash, Tommy interrupted. "That's all right," he said soothingly. "Now what about getting home?" "No home to go to," said Mr. Ryder sadly, and wept. "What hotel are you staying at?" asked Tommy. "Can't go home," said Mr. Ryder. "Treasure hunt. Swell thing to do." "She did it, Whitechapel White Harch, Whitehead Sharrow to the grave dash, never mind that," said Tommy. "Where are you dash?" But Mr. Ryder became suddenly dignified. He drew himself erect and attained a sudden miraculous command over his speech. Young man, I'm telling you. Margie took me. In her car treasure hunting. English aristocracy all do it. Under the cobblestones. £500. Solemn thought, to solemn thought, I'm telling you, young man. You've been kind to me. I've got your welfare at heart, sir, at heart. We Americans. Tommy interrupted him this time with even less ceremony. What's that you say? Mrs. Laidlaw took you in a car? The American nodded with a kind of owlish solemnity. To Whitechapel? Again that owlish nod. And you found £500 there? Mr. Ryder struggled for words. As she did, he corrected his questioner. Left me outside. Outside the door. Always left outside. It's kinder sad. Outside, always outside. Would you know your way there? I guess so. Hank Ryder doesn't lose his bearings. Tommy hauled him along unceremoniously. He found his own car where it was waiting, and presently they were bowling eastward. The cool air revived Mr. Ryder. After slumping against Tommy's shoulder in a kind of stupor, he awoke clear-headed and refreshed. Say, boy, where are we? He demanded. Whitechapel, said Tommy crisply. Is this where you came with Mrs. Laidlaw tonight? It looks kinder familiar, admitted Mr. Ryder, looking round. Seems to me we turned off to the left somewhere down here. That's at that street there. Tommy turned off obediently. Mr. Ryder issued directions. That's it. Sure. And round to the right. Say, aren't the smells awful? Yes, past the pub at the corner, sharp round, and stop at the mouth of that little alley. But what's the big idea? Hand it to me, some of the oof left behind? Are we going to put one over on them? That's exactly it, said Tommy. We're going to put one over on them. Rather a joke, isn't it? I'll tell the world, assented Mr. Ryder. Though I'm just a mite hazed about it all, he ended wistfully. Tommy got out and assisted Mr. Ryder to alight also. They advanced into the alleyway. On the left were the backs of a row of dilapidated houses, most of which had doors opening into the alley. Mr. Ryder came to a stop before one of these doors. In here she went, he declared. It was this door, I am plumb certain of it. They all look very alike, said Tommy. Reminds me of the story of the soldier and the princess. You remember, they made a cross on the door to show which one it was. Shall we do the same? Laughing, he drew a piece of white chalk from his pocket and made a rough cross low down on the door. This is a surprise. I guess you mean that too. I've been laughing fit to bust all this evening, leading you here like a little child. And you so pleased with your cleverness. Why, Sonny, I was on to you from the start. You weren't in with that crowd for your health. I let you play about for a while, and when you got real suspicious of the lovely Marguerite, I said to myself, now's the time to lead into it. I guess your friends won't be hearing of you for some time. Going to do me in? That's the correct expression, I believe. You have got it in for me. You've got a nerve all right. Not, we shan't attempt violence. Just keep you under restraint, so to speak. I'm afraid you're backing the wrong horse, said Tommy. I've no intention of being kept under restraint, as you call it. Mr. Ryder smiled genially. From outside a cat uttered a melancholy cry to the moon. Banking on that cross you put on the door, as Sonny, said Mr. Ryder. I shouldn't if I were you. Because I know that story you mentioned. Heard it when I was a little boy. I stepped back into the alleyway to enact the part of the dog with eyes as big as cartwheels. If you were in that alley now, you would observe that every door in the alley is marked with an identical cross. Tommy drooped his head despondently. Thought you were mighty clever, didn't you? Said Ryder. As the words left his lips, a sharp rapping sounded on the door. What's that? He cried, starting. At the same time, an assault began on the front of the house. The door at the back was a flimsy affair. The lock gave almost immediately, and Inspector Marriott showed in the doorway. Well done, Marriott, said Tommy. You were quite right as to the district. I'd like you to make the acquaintance of Mr. Hank Ryder, who knows all the best fairy tales. You see, Mr. Ryder, he added gently, I've had my suspicions of you. Albert, that important-looking boy with the big ears is Albert, had orders to follow on his motorcycle if you and I went off joy-riding at any time, and whilst I was ostentatiously marking a chalk cross on the door to engage your attention, I also emptied a little bottle of valerian on the ground. Nasty smell, but cats love it. All the cats in the neighborhood were assembled outside to mark the right house when Albert and the police arrived. He looked at the dumbfounded Mr. Ryder with a smile, then rose to his feet. I said I would get you, Crackler, and I have got you, he observed. What the hell are you talking about? Asked Mr. Ryder. What do you mean, Crackler? You will find it in the glossary of the next criminal dictionary, said Tommy. Etymology doubtful. He looked round him with a happy smile. And all done without a nose, he murmured brightly, Good night, Marriott. I must go now to where the happy ending of the story awaits me. No reward like the love of a good woman, and the love of a good woman awaits me at home, that is, I hope it does. But one never knows nowadays. This has been a very dangerous job, Marriott. Do you know Captain Jimmy Faulkner? His dancing is simply too marvelous, and as for his taste in cocktails, Yes, Marriott, it has been a very dangerous job. Agatha Christie, the Sunningdale mystery. Do you know where we are going to lunch today? Tuppence? Mrs. Beresford considered the question. The Ritz, she suggested hopefully. Think again. That nice little place in Soho? No. Tommy's tone was full of importance. An ABC shop. This one, in fact. He drew her deftly inside an establishment of the kind indicated, and steered her to a corner marble-top table. Excellent, said Tommy with satisfaction, as he seated himself. Couldn't be better. Why has this craze for the simple life come upon you? Demanded Tuppence. You see, Watson, but you do not observe. I wonder now whether one of these haughty damsels would condescend to notice us. Splendid, she drifts this way. It is true that she appears to be thinking of something else, but doubtless her subconscious mind is functioning busily with such matters as ham and eggs and pots of tea. Chop and fried potatoes, please, miss, and a large coffee, a roll and butter, and a plate of tongue for the lady. The waitress repeated the order in a scornful tone, but Tuppence leant forward suddenly and interrupted her. No, not a chop and fried potatoes. This gentleman will have a cheesecake and a glass of milk. A cheesecake and a milk, said the waitress with even deeper scorn, if that were possible. Still thinking of something else, she drifted away again. That was uncalled for, said Tommy coldly, but I'm right, aren't I? You are the old man in the corner? Where's your piece of string? Tommy drew a long twisted mesh of string from his pocket and proceeded to tie a couple of knots in it. Complete to the smallest detail, he murmured. "You made a small mistake in ordering your meal, though." "Women are so literal-minded," said Tommy. "If there's one thing I hate, it's milk to drink, and cheesecakes are always so yellow and bilious-looking." "Be an artist," said Tuppence. "Watch me attack my cold tongue. Jolly good stuff, cold tongue. Now then, I'm all ready to be Miss Polly Burton. Tie a large knot and begin." "First of all," said Tommy, speaking in a strictly unofficial capacity, "let me point out this. Business is not too brisk lately. If business does not come to us, we must go to business, apply our minds to one of the great public mysteries of the moment. Which brings me to the point, the Sunningdale mystery." "Ah," said Tuppence, with deep interest. "The Sunningdale mystery." Tommy drew a crumpled piece of newspaper from his pocket and laid it on the table. "That is the latest portrait of Captain Cecil as it appeared in the Daily Leader." "Just so," said Tuppence. "I wonder someone doesn't sue these newspapers sometimes." "You can see it's a man, and that's all." "When I said the Sunningdale mystery, I should have said the so-called Sunningdale mystery," went on Tommy rapidly. "A mystery to the police perhaps, but not to an intelligent mind." "Tie another knot," said Tuppence. "I don't know how much of the case you remember," continued Tommy quietly. "All of it," said Tuppence. "But don't let me cramp your style." "It was just over 3 weeks ago," said Tommy, that gruesome discovery was made on the famous golf links. 2 members of the club who were enjoying an early round were horrified to find the body of a man lying face downwards on the 7th tee. Even before they turned him over, they had guessed him to be Captain Cecil, a well-known figure on the links, and who always wore a golf coat of a peculiarly bright blue color. Captain Cecil was often seen out on the links early in the morning, practicing, and it was thought at first that he had been suddenly overcome by some form of heart disease. But examination by a doctor revealed the sinister fact that he had been murdered. Stabbed to the heart with a significant object, a woman's hat pin. He was also found to have been dead at least 12 hours, that put an entirely different complexion on the matter, and very soon some interesting facts came to light. Practically the last person to see Captain Cecil alive was his friend and partner Mr. Hollaby of the Porcupine Assurance Company, and he told his story as follows. Cecil and he played a round earlier in the day. After tea the others suggested that they should play a few more holes before it got too dark to see. Hollaby assented. Cecil seemed in good spirits, and was in excellent form. There is a public footpath that crosses the links, and just as they were playing up to the 6th green, Hollaby noticed a woman coming along it. She was very tall and dressed in brown, but he did not observe her particularly, and Cecil, he thought, did not notice her at all. The footpath in question crosses in front of the 7th tee, continued Tommy. The woman had passed along this, and was standing at the farther side, as though waiting. Captain Cecil was the first to reach the tee, as Mr. Hollaby was replacing the pin in the hole. As the latter came towards the tee, he was astonished to see Cecil and the woman talking together. As he came nearer, they both turned abruptly, Cecil calling over his shoulder, "Shan't be a minute." The two of them walked off side by side, still deep in earnest conversation. The footpath there leaves the course, and passing between 2 narrow hedges of neighboring gardens comes out on the road to Windlesham. Captain Cecil was as good as his word. He reappeared within a minute or two, much to Hollaby's satisfaction, as 2 other players were coming up behind them. And the light was failing rapidly. They drove off, and at once Hollaby noticed that something had occurred to upset his companion. Not only did he fuzzle his drive badly, but his face was worried, and his forehead creased in a big frown. He hardly answered his companion's remarks, and his golf was atrocious. Evidently something had occurred to put him completely off his game. They played that hole in the eighth, and then Captain Cecil declared abruptly that the light was too bad and that he was off home. Just at that point there is another of those narrow slips leading to the Windlesham Road, and Captain Cecil departed that way, which was a short cut to his home, a small bungalow on the road in question. The other two players came up, a Major Barnard and Mr. Leakey, and to them Hollaby mentioned Captain Cecil's sudden change of manner. They also had seen him speaking to the woman in brown, but had not been near enough to see her face. All three men wondered what she could have said to upset their friend to that extent. They returned to the clubhouse together, and as far as was known at the time, were the last people to see Captain Cecil alive. The day was a Wednesday, and on Wednesdays cheap tickets to London are issued. The man and wife who ran Captain Cecil's small bungalow were up in town according to custom, and did not return until the late train. They entered the bungalow as usual, and supposed their master to be in his room asleep. Mrs. Cecil, his wife, was away on a visit. The murder of the captain was a 9 days' wonder. Nobody could suggest a motive for it. The identity of the tall woman in brown was eagerly discussed, but without result. The police were, as usual, blamed for their supineness most unjustly as time was to show. For a week later, a girl called Doris Evans was arrested and charged with the murder of Captain Anthony Cecil. The police had had little to work upon. A strand of fair hair caught in the dead man's fingers, and a few threads of flame-colored wool caught on one of the buttons of his blue coat. Diligent inquiries at the railway station and elsewhere had elicited the following facts. A young girl dressed in a flame-colored coat and skirt had arrived by Maine that evening about 7 o'clock, and had asked the way to Captain Cecil's house. The same girl had reappeared again at the station 2 hours later. Her hat was awry and her hair tousled, and she seemed in a state of great agitation. She inquired about the trains back to town, and was continually looking over her shoulder as though afraid of something. Our police force is in many ways very wonderful. With this slender evidence to go upon, they managed to track down the girl, and identify her as one Doris Evans. She was charged with murder, and cautioned that anything she might say would be used against her. But she nevertheless persisted in making a statement, and this statement she repeated again in detail, without any substantial variation, at the subsequent proceedings. Her story was this. She was a typist by profession, and had made friends one evening, in a cinema, with a well-dressed man who declared he had taken a fancy to her. His name, he told her, was Anthony, and he suggested that she should come down to his bungalow at Sunningdale. She had no idea then, or at any other time, that he had a wife. It was arranged between them that she should come down on the following Wednesday, the day, you will remember, when the servants would be absent and his wife away from home. In the end he told her his full name was Anthony Cecil, and gave her the name of his house. She duly arrived at the bungalow on the evening in question, and was greeted by Cecil, who had just come in from Shelinks. Though he professed himself delighted to see her, the girl declared that from the first his manner was strange and different. A half-acknowledged fear sprang up in her, and she wished fervently that she had not come. After a simple meal which was all ready and prepared, Cecil suggested going out for a stroll. The girl consenting, he took her out of the house, down the road, and along the slip onto the golf course. And then suddenly, just as they were crossing the 7th tee, he seemed to go completely mad. Drawing a revolver from his pocket, he brandished it in the air, declaring that he had come to the end of his tether. Everything must go. I'm ruined, done for. And you shall go with me. I shall shoot you first, then myself, They will find our bodies here in the morning side by side together in death. And so on a lot more. He had hold of Doris Evans by the arm, and she, realizing she had to do with a madman, made frantic efforts to free herself, or failing that, to get the revolver away from him. They struggled together, and in that struggle he must have torn out a piece of her hair and got the wool of her coat entangled on a button. Finally, with a desperate effort, she freed herself and ran for her life across the golf links, expecting every minute to be shot down with a revolver bullet. She fell twice, tripping over the heather, but eventually regained the road to the station and realized that she was not being pursued. That is the story that Doris Evans tells, and from which she has never varied. She strenuously denies that she ever struck at him with a hat pin in self-defense, a natural enough thing to do under the circumstances, though, and one which may well be the truth. In support of her story, a revolver has been found in the furze bushes near where the body is lying. It had not been fired. Doris Evans has been sent for trial, but the mystery still remains a mystery. If her story is to be believed, who was it who stabbed Captain Cecil? The other woman, the tall woman in brown whose appearance so upset him? So far no one has explained her connection with the case. She appears out of space suddenly on the footpath across the links, she disappears along the slip, and no one ever hears of her again. Who was she? A local resident? A visitor from London? If so, did she come by car or train? There is nothing remarkable about her except her height. No one seems to be able to describe her appearance. She could not have been Doris Evans, for Doris Evans is small and fair, and moreover was only just then arriving at the station. The wife, suggested Tuppence. What about the wife? A very natural suggestion. But Mrs. Cecil is also a small woman, and besides Mr. Holliby knows her well by sight, and there seems no doubt that she was really away from home. One further development has come to light. The Porcupine Assurance Company is in liquidation. The accounts reveal the most daring misappropriation of funds. The reasons for Captain Cecil's wild words to Doris Evans are now quite apparent. For some years past, he must have been systematically embezzling money. Neither Mr. Holliby nor his son had any idea of what was going on. They are practically ruined. The case stands like this. Captain Cecil was on the verge of discovery and ruin. Suicide would be a natural solution, but the nature of the wound rules that theory out. Who killed him? Was it Doris Evans? Was it the mysterious woman in brown? Tommy paused, took a sip of milk, made a wry face, and bit cautiously at the cheesecake. Of course, murmured Tommy, I saw at once where the hitch in this particular case lay. And just where the police were going astray. Yes? Said Tuppence eagerly. Tommy shook his head sadly. I wish I did. Tuppence, it's dead easy being the old man in the corner up to a certain point. But the solution beats me. Who did murder the beggar? I don't know. He took some more newspaper cuttings out of his pocket. Further exhibits. Mr. Holliby. His son. Mrs. Cecil. Doris Evans. Tuppence pounced on the last, and looked at it for some time. She didn't murder him anyway, she remarked at last. Not with a hat pin. Why this certainty? A Lady Molly touch. She's got bobbed hair. Only one woman in 20 uses hat pins nowadays, anyway, long hair or short, hats fit tight and pull on. There's no need for such a thing. Still, she might have had one by her. My dear boy, we don't keep them as heirlooms. What on earth should she have brought a hat pin down to Sunningdale for? Then it must have been the other woman, The woman in brown. I wish she hadn't been tall. Then she could have been the wife. I always suspect wives who are away at the time and so couldn't have had anything to do with it. If she found her husband carrying on with that girl, it would be quite natural for her to go for him with a hat pin. I shall have to be careful, I see, remarked Tommy. But Tuppence was deep in thought and refused to be drawn. What were the Cecils like? She asked suddenly. What sort of thing did people say about them? As far as I can make out, they were very popular. He and his wife were supposed to be devoted to one another. That's what makes the business of the girl so odd. It's the last thing you'd have expected of a man like Cecil. He was an ex-soldier, you know, came into a good bit of money, retired and went into this insurance business. The last man in the world, apparently, whom you would have suspected of being a crook. Is it absolutely certain that he was the crook? Couldn't it have been the other two who took the money? The Hollabys? They say they're ruined. Oh, they say. Perhaps they'd got it all in a bank under another name. I put it foolishly, I dare say, but you know what I mean. Suppose they'd been speculating with the money for some time, unbeknownst to Cecil, and lost it all. It might be jolly convenient for them that Cecil died just when he did. Tommy tapped the photograph of Mr. Hollaby Sr. with his fingernail. So you're accusing this respectable gentleman of murdering his friend and partner? You forget that he parted from Cecil on the links in full view of Barnard and Lecky, and spent the evening in the Dormy house. Besides, there's the hat pin. Bother the hat pin, said Tuppence impatiently. That hat pin, you think, points to the crime having been committed by a woman? Naturally. Don't you agree? No. Men are notoriously old-fashioned. It takes them ages to rid themselves of preconceived ideas. They associate hat pins and hairpins with the female sex, and call them women's weapons. They may have been in the past, but they're both rather out of date now. Why, I haven't had a hat pin or hairpin for the last 4 years. Then you think that it was a man killed Cecil. The hat pin was used to make it seem a woman's crime. There's something in what you say, Tuppence, said Tommy slowly. It's extraordinary how things seem to straighten themselves out when you talk a thing over. Tuppence nodded. Everything must be logical if you look at it the right way. And remember what Marriott once said about the amateur point of view, that it had the intimacy. We know something about people like Captain Cecil and his wife. We know what they're likely to do and what they're not likely to do. And we've each got our special knowledge. Tommy smiled. You mean, he said, that you are an authority on what people with bobbed and shingled heads are likely to have in their possession, and that you have an intimate acquaintance with what wives are likely to feel and do? Something of the sort, and what about me? What is my special knowledge? Do husbands pick up girls, etc.? No, said Tuppence gravely. You know the course you've been on it, not as a detective, searching for clues, but as a golfer. You know about golf, and what's likely to put a man off his game. It must have been something pretty serious to put Cecil off his game. His handicaps too, and from the 7th tee on he played like a child, so they say. Who say? Barnard and Lecky. They were playing just behind him, you remember. That was after he met the woman, the tall woman in brown. They saw him speaking to her, didn't they? Yes, at least. Tommy broke off. Tuppence looked up at him, and was puzzled. He was staring at the piece of string in his fingers, but staring with the eyes of one who sees something very different. Tommy, what is it? Be quiet, tuppence. I'm playing the 6th hole at Sunningdale. Cecil and old Hollaby are holding out on the 6th green ahead of me. It's getting dusk, but I can see that bright blue coat of Cecil's clearly enough. And on the footpath to the left of me there's a woman coming along. She hasn't crossed from the ladies' course that's on the right. I should have seen her if she had done so. And it's odd I didn't see her on the footpath before from the 5th tee, for instance. He paused. You said just now I knew the course, tuppence. Just behind the 6th tee, there's a little hut or shelter made of turf. Anyone could wait in there until the right moment came. They could change their appearance there. I mean, tell me, tuppence, this is where your special knowledge comes in again. Would it be very difficult for a man to look like a woman and then change back to being a man again? Could he wear a skirt over +4s, for instance? Certainly he could. The woman would look a bit bulky, that would be all. A longish brown skirt, say, a brown sweater of the kind both men and women wear, and a woman's felt hat with a bunch of side curls attached each side. That would be all that was needed. I am speaking, of course, of what would pass at a distance, which I take to be what you are driving at. Switch off the skirt, take off the hat and curls, and put on a man's cap which you can carry rolled up in your hand, and there you'd be back as a man again. And the time required for the transformation? From woman to man, 1.5 minutes at the outside, probably a good deal less. The other way about would take longer. You'd have to arrange the hat and curls a bit, and the skirt would stick getting it on over the +4s. That doesn't worry me. It's the time for the first that matters. As I tell you, I'm playing the 6th hole. The woman in brown has reached the 7th tee now. She crosses it and waits. Cecil in his blue coat goes towards her. They stand together a minute, and then they follow the path round the trees out of sight. Hollaby is on the tee alone. 2 or 3 minutes pass. I'm on the green now. The man in the blue coat comes back and drives off, fuzzling badly. The light's getting worse. I and my partner go on. Ahead of us are those two, Cecil slicing and topping and doing everything he shouldn't do. At the 8th green, I see him stride off and vanish down the slip. What happened to him to make him play like a different man? The woman in brown or the man, if you think it was a man? Exactly, and where they were standing out of sight, remember, of those coming after them there's a deep tangle of furze bushes. You could thrust a body in there, and it would be pretty certain to lie hidden until the morning. Tommy. You think it was then, but someone would have heard heard what? The doctors agreed death must have been instantaneous. I've seen men killed instantaneously in the war. They don't cry out as a rule, just a gurgle, or a moan, perhaps just a sigh, or a funny little cough. Cecil comes towards the 7th tee, and the woman comes forward and speaks to him. He recognizes her perhaps, as a man he knows masquerading, curious to learn the why and wherefore, he allows himself to be drawn along the footpath out of sight. One stab with the deadly hat pin as they walk along. Cecil falls dead. The other man drags his body into the furze bushes, strips off the blue coat, then sheds his own skirt and the hat and curls. He puts on Cecil's well-known blue coat and cap, and strides back to the tee. 3 minutes would do it. The others behind can't see his face, only the peculiar blue coat they know so well. They never doubt that it's Cecil, but he doesn't play Cecil's brand of golf. They all say he played like a different man. Of course he did. He was a different man. But point number 2. His action in bringing the girl down there was the action of a different man. It wasn't Cecil who met Doris Evans at a cinema and induced her to come down to Sunningdale, it was a man calling himself Cecil. Remember, Doris Evans wasn't arrested until a fortnight after the crime. She never saw the body. If she had, she might have bewildered everyone by declaring that that wasn't the man who took her out on the golf links that night, and spoke so wildly of suicide. It was a carefully laid plot. The girl invited down for Wednesday when Cecil's house would be empty. Then the hat pin which pointed to its being a woman's doing. The murderer meets the girl, takes her into the bungalow and gives her supper, then takes her out on the links, and when he gets to the scene of the crime, brandishes his revolver and scares the life out of her. Once she is taken to her heels, all he has to do is to pull out the body and leave it lying on the tee. The revolver he chucks into the bushes. Then he makes a neat parcel of the skirt and hat, and now I admit I'm guessing, in all probability walks to Woking, which is only about 6 or 7 miles away, and goes back to town from there. Wait a minute, said Tuppence. There's one thing you haven't explained. What about Holliby? Holliby? Yes. I admit that the people behind couldn't have seen whether it was really Cecil or not. But you can't tell me that the man who was playing with him was so hypnotized by the blue coat that he never looked at his face. My dear old thing, said Tommy. That's just the point. Holliby knew all right. You see, I'm adopting your theory that Holliby and his son were the real embezzlers. The murderer's got to be a man who knew Cecil pretty well, knew, for instance, about the servants being always out on a Wednesday, and that his wife was away. And also someone who was able to get an impression of Cecil's latchkey. I think Holliby Jr. would fulfill all these requirements. He's about the same age and height as Cecil, and they were both clean-shaven men. Doris Evans probably saw several photographs of the murdered man reproduced in the papers, but as you yourself observed, one can just see that it's a man, and that's about all. Didn't she ever see Holliby in court? The son never appeared in the case at all. Why should he? He had no evidence to give. It was old Holliby, with his irreproachable alibi, who stood in the limelight throughout. Nobody has even bothered to inquire what son was doing that particular evening. It all fits in, admitted Tuppence. She paused a minute, and then asked, Are you going to tell all this to the police? I don't know if they'd listen. They'll listen all right, said an unexpected voice behind him. Tommy swung round to confront Inspector Marriott. The inspector was sitting at the next table. In front of him was a poached egg. Often drop in here to lunch, said Inspector Marriott. As I was saying, we'll listen all right. In fact, I've been listening. I don't mind telling you that we've not been quite satisfied all along over those porcupine figures. You see, we've had our suspicions of those Hollibys. But nothing to go upon. Too sharp for us. Then this murder came, and that seemed to upset all our ideas, but thanks to you and the lady, sir, we'll confront young Holliby and Doris Evans and see if she recognizes him. I rather fancy she will. That's a very ingenious idea of yours about the blue coat. I'll see that Blunt's brilliant detectives get the credit for it. You are a nice man, Inspector Marriott, said Tuppence gratefully. We think a lot of you too at the Yard, replied that stolid gentleman. You'd be surprised. If I may ask you, sir, what's the meaning of that piece of string? Nothing, said Tommy, stuffing it into his pocket. A bad habit of mine. As to the cheesecake and the milk, I am on a diet. Nervous dyspepsia. Busy men are always martyrs to it. Ah, said the detective, I thought perhaps you'd been reading well. It's of no consequence. But the inspector's eyes twinkled.